Alrighty, guys, welcome back. I want to say thank you if you watched the last video, and if you didn't, that's all right. But thank you for taking the time to come watch this video now. All right, but yeah. So last week we talked about a lot of stuff, and just before we get started, I forgot to mention, and this is a cardinal sin. I know I forgot to mention who I'm even referencing in these videos specifically. So in this series of videos, I'll be referencing the book The Limits of Racial Domination, Plebeian Society in Colonial Mexico City, 1660 to 1720, by Dr. Robert Douglas Cope. Unfortunately, he is no longer with us, but he left us some great work, and so I'll be discussing section by section of his book. So if you have it, awesome. If you don't, that's kind of why I'm breaking down these, making these videos to better explain the limits of racial domination in plebeian society in colonial Mexico City. So, anyways, let's get to it. Well, today in Mon Carnet de Poche, we will be diving deeper into the lives of plebeians in colonial Mexico City. In the last episode, I talked about how the rigid racial hierarchy, the sistema de castas, shaped colonial society. But what about the day-to-day struggles of the people living at the bottom of that system? What was life really like for the urban poor? I'd love to know, or I don't know if you'd like to, but I do. So anyways, in this particular episode, I'll be looking at how plebeians survived in one of the largest cities of the Spanish Empire at the time. From the overcrowded homes and streets to the constant threat of disease and poverty, the urban poor of Mexico City faced plenty of challenges at every turn. But they also built strong social networks, adapted to their environment, and made do with what little they had. So let's take a closer look at that. Alrighty, so the first topic of this video series, or of this particular video, will be environmental and sanitation challenges. And let's kind of describe what it was. Now, when we think of Mexico City during the 17th century, we kind of have to imagine a city that was overcrowded, unsanitary, and definitely filled with hazards. The streets were crammed with people, animals, and, well, pretty much everything else you could imagine for that time. And if you've been to Mexico City lately, you'll think, oh my goodness, that sounds kind of the same. But I think there's a stark difference. Yes, the city currently is extremely crowded, beyond what it ought to be, especially for a sinking city. I add that. I wouldn't say it's completely unsanitary. I've been to dirtier cities in the States and in Mexico and in other parts of the world, but it is not the cleanliest city per se. It's no what's a good example? Provo, Utah. It's not a Provo, Utah, okay? And it's definitely filled with hazards. Crazy drivers, every common type of hazard. It's there. But it was very different. They nowadays Mexico City has electricity. It has a little bit more order, more security per se. And so things were a little bit different. But yes, it's in many ways it's still the same, but not the same. Sorry if that's confusing. Anyways, let me continue. So for the plebes, the environment was one of the most constant challenges that they dealt with. They dealt with, again, pollution, filth, and disease, where literally at every part of life, it was an everyday reality for them. While the elite lived in their grand homes and their haciendas with private courtyards, the poor didn't have that. They were stuck in the narrow streets where waste disposal was almost non-existent, at least according to the book by Dr. Cope. He did mention that garbage and filth were regularly tossed into the streets. So imagine living your life with the smell of rotting trash in the air and sewage flowing in open gutters. And I know you're probably thinking, oh shit, well that's LA, or maybe that's some other, but I think this was worse. And I know for a fact that this wasn't just an issue in Mexico City. In fact, many cities throughout the world at that period and throughout various periods of time dealt with that very issue. I mean, I was recently in Edinburgh, in Glasgow, with my wife, where her ancestry comes from, and while we were on some of the tours, we learned about some of the uncleanly habits that people had. And so we know that this isn't an isolated issue pertaining simply just to Mexico City. No, it's something that London, Edinburgh, New York, Hong Kong, every city, major city at one point dealt with. So, but yeah, just so you all know. Anyways, and then there was that big issue of drainage, or really the lack of it in Mexico City. In case you all don't know, Mexico City was built on what was once the Great Lake Texcoco, and although the Spanish tried to drain the lake, their systems were far from perfect. As Dr. Cope points out, the city's drainage systems were frequently overwhelmed, particularly during the rainy season, leaving entire neighborhoods flooded. So, and here's the thing. While the wealthier neighborhoods had slightly better infrastructure to protect themselves from flooding, the plebes lived in the lowest and most vulnerable parts of the city, and that was mostly the outskirts. The poorest parts of Mexico City, like the barrios near the markets and the docks, were constantly flooded, turning streets into rivers of mud and sewage. And after major storms, it wasn't uncommon for plebeians to have their homes be underwater for days. And in fact, actually, we still kind of see that nowadays in Mexico City. I don't know how often you guys follow Mexico City headlines, but when the rainy season comes, Mexico City gets flooded and homes get wrecked, and it's still a thing. It's been 400 years and it's still a thing. So I guess we haven't moved on, but it's still a thing. And in fact, one of the worst instances of flooding hit Mexico City in 1629, when heavy rains caused the city to flood for nearly 5 years. Could you imagine that? That's ridiculous. 5 years flooding. The city. I've been to parts of Mexico City where they have plaques showing where the flood hit on those buildings that are still there to this day, and it was pretty darn high. It's incredible, and it stayed like that for 5 years. So for the poor, this was catastrophic. As Dr. Cope notes, the flood of 1629 submerged Mexico City for years, and while the elite could flee to safer, drier ground, the urban poor were trapped. And that's intense. And actually, that leads us into a whole other discussion, which I won't talk about migration outside of Mexico City, which kind of helped develop cities like Puebla, Guadalajara, and different parts of present-day Mexico. But anyways, can you just imagine trying to live and work in a city where your home and workplace are literally underwater? It'd be incredibly hard. But these people did it. They did it. And if the floods weren't enough, disease was always lurking around the corner. The unsanitary conditions made the city a breeding ground for epidemics. From smallpox to typhus, the plebes were constantly at risk of deadly outbreaks. And Dr. Cope actually explains that due to the poor sanitary conditions and overcrowded living arrangements, plebeian neighborhoods were particularly vulnerable to waves of disease. These were not just occasional outbreaks either. Disease was a regular part of life. And not to the extent that we perhaps see it nowadays. It was a little bit more intense, because now we have the benefits of modern medicine and maybe going to an Instacare. But they didn't have that at all. And unlike the elite who could afford better health care and even flee the city during epidemics, the poor were always stuck in place. Many plebeians couldn't afford doctors, and even if they could, there wasn't much the medical field could really offer at the time. So they relied heavily on home remedies, religious rituals, and sheer luck. And sometimes, honestly, it feels like that too with how much healthcare is nowadays. Like, it's ridiculous. At least here in the States. Perhaps some of y'all elsewhere have better luck with that, but here in the States, we don't have that luxury per se. And so, in order to survive in this kind of environment, the plebes had to rely on their community and definitely their own resourcefulness. Oh, sorry, that's a long word. Resourcefulness. And let's not forget the animals. If you walked through a plebeian neighborhood in the 17th century of Mexico City, you'd probably be stepping over pigs, chickens, goats, and definitely stray dogs. The stray dogs are still an issue to this day. Not as bad as they might have been a couple years ago or even back then, but they're still there. Not so much the pigs or the goats, maybe an occasional chicken, but yeah. Anyways, the animals definitely lived side by side with people, which only made the sanitation issue worse. Dr. Cope mentions that livestock were often kept inside the home or roamed freely through the streets, contributing to the filth and health risks. So, not only were these neighborhoods overcrowded with people, but animals were added to the chaos. But, despite all of this, despite the filth, the flooding, the disease, the plebeians definitely found ways to survive, and not just survive, but adapt. And that helped them build strong social networks, and it kind of forced them to rely on their communities to get through the worst of times. And I'll talk about this a little bit more. And so in this next section, we're going to be talking about housing and living conditions. So we've talked about the environment. Let's definitely take a little bit more of a look at where the plebes actually lived. And if you were a member of the urban poor in colonial Mexico City, your living conditions were likely as rough as the streets outside. Housing for plebes was crowded, often in disrepair and far from the grand estates of the Spanish elites. Homes, and those things weren't insane, but very different. So, I guess we have to ask ourselves, like, what kind of homes did plebes live in? Well, for starters, let's forget about privacy. Most plebeian families lived in a single-room home or rented rooms in larger buildings that were subdivided into cramped quarters. These were often called vecindades, which were essentially shared housing complexes. And as Dr. Cope explains, a typical plebeian household was small, often consisting of 1 or 2 rooms with minimal furniture. And when we say minimal furniture, we really mean it, okay? Most plebeian homes had only the bare essentials, maybe a table, a couple of stools, and a bed that everyone shared. And believe it or not, it wasn't uncommon for livestock to share the space too. Dr. Cope notes that chickens, pigs, and sometimes even goats were kept inside the home, adding to the cramped conditions. So, not only were these homes crowded with people, but they were filled with animals, which made the already poor sanitation even worse. And it's important to remember that these homes weren't just small, they were also in bad conditions. Many of the buildings where plebeians lived were neglected by their landlords. Dr. Cope mentions in his book that landlords who were often wealthy elites or members of the church had little interest in maintaining their properties, leaving them to fall into disrepair. And honestly, I think that's a common trend in many societies. I've definitely had my fair share of apartments where that definitely feels like it's the case. Landlords do not care, and they just kind of let the whole thing fall apart and blame it on us and take our deposit. But that's another topic. Anyways, the reason for this neglect, well, many landlords simply didn't care about their plebeian tenants. They were happy just to collect the rent, but investing in repairs, definitely not so much. This meant that plebes often had to deal with crumbling walls, leaking roofs, and rat infestations, all while trying to scrape together enough money to pay rent. And it wasn't just the landlords who were the problem. The church, which owned a significant amount of property in Mexico City, my bad, I got the Catholic Church in this case particularly, they were also a major landlord in Mexico City. They weren't any better at maintaining their buildings, despite their moral responsibility to care for the poor. And as Dr. Cope notes, ecclesiastical landlords, including various religious orders, rented out rooms to the poor, but often ignored the deteriorating conditions of these properties. Close quote, sorry. Dr. Cope. So, let's get this. You've got overcrowded homes, shared spaces with livestock, and decaying buildings that no one is willing to fix. But that wasn't the end of the story here, okay? Many plebes didn't even have a secure home at all. Rent was a constant concern for the poor, and it wasn't uncommon for families to be evicted if they couldn't keep up with payments. This led to an almost sort of nomadic existence for some plebes, moving from one dilapidated room to another, in search of any sort of shelter. And what made matters worse was that these housing conditions were located in the poorest, most flood-prone areas of the city. So, when the floods hit, these poorly built homes often took the brunt of the damage, leaving families with nowhere to go. So, imagine living in a house that's already falling apart and then having to deal with waist-deep water in every rainy season. And you might get evicted. Not an ideal situation, I think. And between the overcrowded homes, poor sanitation, and constant threat of eviction, life in these plebeian neighborhoods was far from easy. But despite these hardships, the urban poor found ways to survive, often by relying on each other. So in the next section, we'll take a closer look at how these plebeians formed a tight-knit community and social networks that helped them get by. So, social networks and survival. We've covered the challenges that plebeians faced, from floods, disease, overcrowded homes, and neglect from landlords. But how do they survive in such a tough environment? The answer lies in their strong social networks. For the urban poor, community wasn't just important, it was critical for their survival. In colonial Mexico City, plebeians couldn't rely on the government or the elite for help. Instead, they turned to their neighbors, families, and religious communities for support. One of the key social structures that held plebeian society together was compadrazgo, or the godparent system. Now, when we typically think of godparents in religious terms, we think of, doing a whole ceremony if you're Catholic, and there's kind of a ceremony to it. But in plebeian society, it was much more than just the religious sense of, being godparents or having godparents. In plebeian neighborhoods, compadrazgo wasn't just about spiritual guidance. It was a way to create strong, lifelong social bonds. According to Dr. Cope, and let me read this so I don't mess it up, compadrazgo functioned as both a religious and social institution, providing a network of mutual aid that extended beyond the family. So, this system allowed plebes to form an alliance that they could depend on, whether it was for financial support, childcare, or even finding work. So, in a city where the poor were constantly struggling to make ends meet, these bonds were critical. Your godparents weren't just there for special occasions, they could step in when times were tough. Cope explains that in many cases, godparents were expected to help their godchildren financially or provide other forms of assistance, particularly in times of crisis. So, if you were sick or out of work, your compadres could often be the first ones you turned to for help. And honestly, just looking back at my personal family history, I still see this. Even though my family isn't per se Catholic, I have a lot of family members that still have their compadres, and whenever they do interact, and I've seen them the few times I have, and I have heard of what their interactions are like, it's always like this. It's not for religious reasons, it's for helping each other out in times of crisis, or situations of near crisisness, per se. So beyond the family and godparent system, plebes also found community and support through cofradías, or religious brotherhoods. These were social and religious organizations that brought folks together from the same trade or neighborhood. But more than just a place for prayer, cofradías provided a crucial safety net for the urban poor. Cofradías helped plebes in all sorts of ways, from organizing religious festivals, which in Mexico there were tons, and there still is tons, to providing financial assistance in times of needs. Dr. Cope notes that cofradías often took on the role of providing charity to their members, such as paying for funeral expenses or helping a family during illness or death. Close quote. These brotherhoods were definitely a lifeline for many plebes, offering them not only spiritual comfort, but also practical support. And it's important to remember that for plebes, life was unpredictable. Illness, injury, or unemployment could strike at any time, and without a social safety net provided by the government, they had to rely on each other. These social structures, compadrazgos and cofradías, became a kind of informal welfare system, if we could think about it that way. People weren't just looking out for themselves, they were looking out for their entire community. And I personally think that's a really cool thing, and I'm kind of glad that they did develop those systems. And It wasn't just formal structures like godparenthood or brotherhoods that kept the community strong. Everyday interactions like sharing food, helping a neighbor fix their roof, or even gather at the market created a very tight-knit network of support. Dr. Cope writes that plebes' reliance on mutual aid was not limited to formal institutions, but was an everyday practice rooted in neighborhood life. But beyond survival, these networks were also a form of resistance, if we think about it. By relying on each other instead of the elite, or the authorities in this case, the plebes were creating their own world within the city. They didn't need the elite to tell them how to live. They had their own systems, their own traditions, and their own ways of helping each other. And in many ways, that was a straight middle finger to the elite. So, this ability to adapt and rely on each other allowed the plebes to endure even the harshest conditions. And so, in this next section, I will kind of talk about the important aspects of plebeian life, which included the role of material culture and how the urban poor made a use of the limited resources they had. So, part 5 of this video, the role of material culture. Now that we've kind of gone over how plebeians built strong social networks to survive, let's take a look at the material world. Life in colonial Mexico City wasn't just about getting by with help of family or friends. It was also about making the most of the few possessions you did have. So, material culture were, in this case, the clothes you wore, the tools you used, and even the food you ate. They all played a huge role in how the urban poor navigated their daily lives. And the urban poor didn't have much in the way of material wealth, but that didn't mean they didn't value their possessions. In fact, the few things that they did own were essential to their survival. As Cope explains, for the plebes, material goods were often tools of survival, necessary for work, cooking, and maintaining the household. Close quote. Every item in the home had a purpose, and there was little room for excess. And so let's start with one of the most basic but important elements of plebeian life, which was cooking utensils. The urban poor often owned just enough to prepare simple meals, maybe a few pots, a clay stove, and some wooden spoons. These items weren't just tools, they were symbols of a family's ability to feed themselves, even when food was scarce. Dr. Cope notes that possessions such as clay pots, griddles, and pestles were among the most valued in the plebeian household, representing both nourishment and survival, close quote. But beyond the kitchen, plebeians also relied on the tools of their trade. Many of the urban poor were artisans, laborers, or small-time traders, and the tools that they used for work were among their most prized possessions. Whether it was a tailor's needle, or carpenter's hammer, or a merchant's scale, these tools were vital to making a living. And as Dr. Cope writes in his book, in a society where most plebeians worked with their hands, the tools of their trade were often their most important possessions. And let's not forget something very important, and that is clothing, which we all still very much value to this day. For the elite, clothing was all about showing off wealth and status, but for the plebes, it was about practicality and survival. Yeah. Many plebes owned only maybe 1 or 2 outfits, which were worn until they were threadbare. Dr. Cope writes, while the clothes of the plebeians was often simple and practical, it still held value, particularly as clothing could be passed down, pawned, or even sold in times of need. Close quote. And speaking of pawn shops, let's talk about how plebes sometimes had to part with the very few things that they did have just in order to survive. Pawn shops were a major part of plebeian life, and it wasn't uncommon for families to pawn their most valued items during tough times. We read that items such as clothing, cooking utensils, and tools were frequently pawned, often as a last resort to buy food or pay rent. And for many plebes, pawning goods was a temporary solution for an ongoing problem. They often intended to buy their items back when things improved, but the reality was that many families never managed to do so. This created a cycle of poverty where the few possessions they had could disappear when times got tough. And additionally, beyond pawning and selling goods, plebes also turned to bartering, a fun thing to do nowadays if you go to a mercado. Well, it depends on the mercado, but anyways, since money was often in short supply, trading goods kind of became a common way to get what you needed. Dr. Cope tells us that in plebeian markets, bartering was a common practice, particularly among those who liked cash but had items of value to exchange. Voila. Here we have our capitalist system, which, was definitely in existence then, so just so you guys know. Markets like the Baratillo, a secondhand market in Mexico City, were essential for plebes who couldn't afford new things. The Baratillo was more than just a place to buy and sell used goods. It was a social hub where plebes could come together to exchange not just items, but information and news. So the good old chisme. It's been here forever, guys. Chisme is not going away. It was a space outside of the control of the elites where the urban poor could assert their own agency, even if it was through something as simple as buying and selling second-hand clothes. And in a society where material goods were often scarce, plebes made it every item count, from the tools they used to the clothes on their own backs, to the pots and pans in their kitchens. Material culture was a key part of how the urban poor survived. And just as importantly, it was a part of how they navigated the economic and social systems that kept them at the bottom. And so, just to go into this last part of our conclusion and aftermath, I want to thank you for listening to this long video. But let's talk about the end. So, what can we learn from the everyday lives of the plebeians in colonial Mexico City? And there's a lot we can learn. Despite living in a world full of challenges, floods, disease, overcrowding, and poverty, the urban poor found ways to survive, adapt, and even resist the systems that were designed to keep them at the bottom. We've seen how they built strong social networks through godparenthood and religious brotherhoods, how they made use of every material possession to make ends meet, and how they navigated a harsh environment that often seemed stacked against them. Life was tough, but the plebes weren't just passive victims of their circumstances. They were active participants in their own survival. And as we've seen, material culture played a huge role in how plebes managed their daily lives. Every pot, every tool, every item of clothes had value. And when times were tough, they turned to pawn shops, bartering, and secondhand markets to keep themselves afloat. This wasn't just about survival. It was about navigating a system that often tried to leave them with nothing. And, for that, bravo to them. Thank you for all that, because that played a big role later on in the history of present-day Mexico. So, the story of plebeians in colonial Mexico City is a reminder that even in the most difficult circumstances, people find ways to adapt, support each other, and push back against the systems that oppress them. The urban poor weren't just invisible workers. They were a community, a culture, and a vital part of the city's fabric. So, in the next episode, we'll continue exploring the world of colonial Mexico City. We'll focus on another crucial aspect of plebeian life. And I look forward to that discussion. Thanks for joining me on this little video. Well, actually, it's a long video that looks into the past of Mexico City. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to subscribe and hit that like button. Let me know in the comments what aspect of plebeian life surprised you the most. There is a lot more history to uncover here on Mon Carne de Poche, so stay tuned for our next deep dive into the lives of everyday people who helped shape history. Bye.